Friday, September 14th, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, United States. Corporal Fumiko Tanaka stood frozen beneath the pine trees as an American soldier extended a clean blanket toward her, his eyes carefully averted from her face. The September air carried the scent of fresh bread from the mess hall. Real wheat bread, not the sawdust mixture she'd choked down in Manila, and the autumn chill bit through her threadbare uniform. Her hands trembled as she reached for the blanket, waiting for the moment he would demand something in return. "Ma'am," he said in careful, practiced Japanese, before turning and walking away without looking back. Fumiko's breath caught in her throat. Around her, 11 other Japanese women, nurses, and civilian administrators captured during the fall of Manila stood in similar states of disbelief, clutching their issued blankets. The compound stretched before them with orderly rows of wooden barracks, electric lights glowing in the fading daylight, and not a single guard tower pointing inward. "Uso," whispered Private Keiko Yamamoto beside her. A lie. This must be a lie. But the bread smell was real, the blanket's warmth was real, and the American soldiers' retreating footsteps crunching on gravel were undeniably real. The indoctrination Fumiko Tanaka had served as a medical assistant with the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Area Army in the Philippines since 1943. Born in Yokohama in 1922, she had been 21 when she volunteered for overseas service, believing the radio broadcasts that promised glory and purpose in supporting the co-prosperity sphere. Her brother had died at Guadalcanal. Her father worked 16-hour shifts in a munitions factory. Service felt like duty. The propaganda machine had taught her specific truths about the enemy. American soldiers were Kichiku Beye, Anglo-American devils who raped, tortured, and murdered Japanese women. Military training films showed dramatizations of American brutality. Women dragged from their homes, children bayoneted, entire villages burned. If captured, her commanding officer had stated during their final briefing in Manila, "Expect no mercy. They will use you, then discard you like trash." The numbers supported Japan's narrative of its own strength. Japan had conquered vast territories: French Indochina, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma. The Dai Nippon Teikoku seemed unstoppable in those early years. Yet by 1945, reality had intruded. Rice rations in Manila had dwindled to 150 grams daily, barely a cup of kernels. Fumiko's own weight had dropped from 52 kilograms to 38. Medical supplies had vanished. She'd amputated a soldier's gangrenous leg with a rusty saw, and no anesthesia. The propaganda never mentioned starvation. It never mentioned watching comrades die from infections that could have been cured with basic antibiotics that no longer existed. It never mentioned the hollow-eyed desperation of soldiers who'd eaten tree bark and leather boots. When American forces surrounded Manila in February 1945, Fumiko had expected immediate death. She had hidden a small knife in her uniform, prepared to use it on herself rather than face what the propaganda promised. Instead, American soldiers had simply pointed rifles and said, "Hands up." No one had touched her. No one had even approached within 2 meters. The cognitive dissonance had begun then, and it would only deepen. First contact. The impossible food. The processing center at Leyte had been Fumiko's first encounter with American abundance. She had been photographed, given a numbered tag, and directed to a tent marked with a red cross. Inside, a female American nurse, blonde, impossibly tall, wearing clean white fabric, had examined her without speaking. The examination table had been covered with fresh paper. Fresh paper. Fumiko's hands had touched it, feeling its crispness. In Manila, they'd been reusing bandages for 6 months, boiling them in rainwater to remove blood and pus. This American nurse had crumpled up the paper after Fumiko stood, tossing it into a waste bin without a second glance. They waste what we would kill for, Fumiko had thought. But the food had shattered her worldview completely. The mess hall at Leyte had served dinner at 1800 hours. Bread with butter, soup with visible chunks of meat, canned peaches, real coffee. Fumiko had stared at the metal tray, her mind unable to process what her eyes showed her. American prisoners of war camps were supposed to be death sentences. Everyone knew this. The radio had said so. The officers had said so. "Tabete kudasai," an American sergeant had said in halting Japanese, gesturing toward the food. "Please eat." Keiko, sitting beside her, had whispered, "It's poisoned." But it wasn't. Around them, other Japanese prisoners, mostly male soldiers, were eating, some weeping as they chewed. An army private 2 tables away had vomited from eating too quickly after months of starvation. The medics had rushed to help him, not to punish him. Fumiko had taken a single bite of bread. The wheat flavor had exploded across her tongue. Real wheat, not mixed with sawdust or rice husks. The texture was soft, nearly sweet. She had eaten slowly, mechanically, while her mind screamed contradictions. Japanese civilians at home were starving on 300-calorie daily rations. Here, the evening meal alone appeared to contain 2,000 calories. American ration points allocated to the camp provided $45 per person per day, more than an entire week's food budget for a Tokyo family. The numbers were impossible. The reality was impossible. Yet here Fumiko sat, chewing impossibly soft bread, while tears ran down her cheeks. Accumulation of evidence. September 15, 1945. The showers at Camp McCoy operated with hot water. Hot water that poured from pipes at the turn of a metal handle, unlimited, steaming in the cool Wisconsin morning. Fumiko stood beneath the spray for 7 minutes. She counted, waiting for it to run out or turn cold. It did neither. In the Philippines, she had bathed once weekly with a single bucket of brackish water. During the siege of Manila, bathing had ceased entirely for 2 months. The American camp provided soap. Real soap that lathered, smelling faintly of lavender, issued to each prisoner in pressed bars. Staff Sergeant Dorothy Chen, a Chinese-American MUC assigned as interpreter, had explained the camp's rules that morning. Work detail is voluntary. Medical care is provided daily. You will receive the same rations as American military personnel. Letters home will be facilitated through the Red Cross. The same rations. Fumiko had heard this and thought it another lie, but lunch that day confirmed it. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, milk, apple pie. The quantity of food was staggering. The waste was even more staggering. She watched American guards scraping half-eaten portions into garbage bins that by day's end would contain more protein than her entire unit in Manila had seen in January 1945. Lieutenant Michio Saito, a former Army nurse captured at Corregidor and only recently transferred to McCoy, later recorded her shock. I could not reconcile what I witnessed with what I had been taught. If Americans possessed such abundance, why had we been told they were weak and decadent? If they could feed their prisoners better than Japan fed its soldiers, what did that say about the empire's strength? September 18, 1945. The camp library stocked newspapers. Fumiko discovered this when Sergeant Chen invited the women to select books for recreation. The newspapers, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, Life magazine, lay on wooden tables, free for anyone to read. The propaganda had portrayed American media as controlled, censored, weak. These papers openly criticized military decisions, debated government policy, published casualty numbers. One editorial questioned whether Japanese prisoners were being treated too well, arguing that given Japanese atrocities against Allied POWs, perhaps revenge was justified. No revenge came. Fumiko read accounts of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction described was biblical. Cities vaporized, 70,000 dead in Hiroshima instantly, thousands more dying from radiation sickness. One single bomb. The technical specifications listed in Life detailed the weapon's explosive yield, equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. Japan's largest conventional bombs carried 500 kilograms of explosives. The mathematical comparison was devastating. American weapons technology exceeded Japan's by magnitudes impossible to comprehend. We never had a chance, Keiko whispered, reading over Fumiko's shoulder. Did we? The question hung unanswered. September 22, 1945. Medical care was provided without question or cost. Fumiko had watched this principle in action when Private Sachiko Ito developed appendicitis. The camp physician, a tired-looking captain with gray temples, had examined Sachiko, immediately arranged transport to the base hospital, and performed surgery within 4 hours. Fumiko had assisted in dozens of field surgeries in the Philippines. She knew what emergency appendectomies looked like without proper facilities, bloody, desperate, with mortality rates above 40%. Sachiko's surgery had been conducted in a tiled operating room with electric lights, anesthesia, antibiotics, blood transfusions. 3 days later, Sachiko was walking, eating solid food, and complaining about boredom. In Manila, Fumiko told Sergeant Chen she would have died. Chen's expression remained professionally neutral. Here, she doesn't have to. The contrast gnawed at Fumiko's understanding of the world. Japan had sacrificed everything for military victory, food, resources, lives, claiming spiritual strength would overcome material weakness. But America possessed both material abundance and the willingness to extend it even to enemies. Where was Japan's spiritual advantage if the corrupt Americans showed greater humanity? September 28, 1945, the men's compound held approximately 1,200 Japanese soldiers, separated from the women's section by 200 meters of open ground and a chain-link fence. During recreation hours, limited supervised interaction was permitted. Fumiko spoke with Colonel Takeshi Nakamura, a career officer captured at Okinawa, who had spent 4 months in American custody. His perspective had undergone complete transformation. "I fought at Iwo Jima before Okinawa," Nakamura explained, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I saw what American industrial capacity could produce. Endless artillery shells, fleets of bombers that darkened the sky. We fired everything we had, and still they came." He described the statistics he'd learned during interrogation, facts his captors had freely shared. American steel production in 1944 exceeded 80 million tons annually. Japan's had peaked at 7 million. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft that same year. Japan managed 28,000. "We were fighting with swords against machine guns," Nakamura said. "Our spiritual training demanded we fight to the death. Their industrial capacity meant death was the only outcome we could achieve." The colonel leaned closer, lowering his voice. "But here is what troubles me most, Corporal. They treat us better than our own officers did. Better food, better shelter, better medicine. They follow rules even when their prisoners don't deserve mercy. What does it mean when your enemy is more honorable than your commanders?" October 3, 1945. The incident that would permanently alter Fumiko's worldview occurred on a Wednesday afternoon. A newly arrived transport had brought 20 additional Japanese women prisoners from the Philippines, administrators, translators, and one woman named Akiko, who had worked in a Manila officers' club. Akiko was 23, thin from malnutrition, with eyes that held a desperate calculation Fumiko recognized. That evening, Akiko had approached an American guard, a young corporal with red hair, and propositioned him. The exact words were later disputed, but witnesses agreed on the essentials. Akiko had offered companionship, intimacy, anything the American wanted in exchange for extra food or protection. She had been trained by circumstance and propaganda to believe this was the inevitable transaction, that American soldiers' kindness was merely delayed predation. The guard's response had been swift and unmistakable. He had stepped back, face flushing red, and called for Sergeant Chen. Chen had spoken with Akiko in rapid Japanese, taken her to the barracks, and returned alone. The guard had filed a report documenting the incident, not to punish Akiko, but to ensure no misunderstanding occurred. Fumiko had heard the entire exchange from 10 meters away. She had watched Akiko's confusion transform into humiliation, then disbelief. The American had refused, not with violence or mockery, but with obvious discomfort and immediate retreat. That night, lying on her assigned cot with its clean sheets and wool blanket, Fumiko finally confronted the truth she'd been resisting for 3 weeks. The propaganda had been comprehensively, systematically false. American soldiers were not bestial rapists. They were tired young men following strict codes of conduct. They did not brutalize prisoners. They fed them, healed them, and treated them according to rules that Japanese forces had abandoned long ago. The realization crushed her. Her brother had died for lies. Her country had fought for lies. The starvation, the suffering, the millions of deaths, all predicated on falsehoods about enemy weakness and moral superiority. Fumiko wept into her pillow, quietly, while around her other women lay awake in their own silent reckonings. The breaking point, October 7, 1945. A group discussion was held in the women's barracks, facilitated by Sergeant Chen, but driven by the prisoners themselves. 19 women sat in a circle, speaking truths that would have been treasonous weeks earlier. "My father told me Americans were demons," Keiko began. "He showed me propaganda posters of American soldiers with fangs and claws. I believed him. He believed them. We all believed.
Lieutenant Saito, the senior officer present, spoke next. I treated American POWs at a hospital in Manila in 1944. We gave them minimal rations, no medicine, no care beyond what prevented immediate death. I thought this was war. I thought they would do the same to us.
Her voice cracked. I was wrong. One by one, the women shared their realizations, the abundance they witnessed daily, the medical care that saved lives without question, the rules enforced even when guarding the enemy. The systematic respect shown to people who should have been, according to Japanese propaganda, treated as subhuman. Fumiko found herself speaking, words emerging unbidden. We were taught that surrender was dishonor, that death was preferable to capture, but they don't see us as dishonorable. They see us as prisoners who deserve basic humanity. The dishonor was not in surviving. The dishonor was in what we were taught. The circle fell silent. Outside, autumn wind rattled the barrack windows. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played Glenn Miller's orchestra, the sound drifting across the American base where enemy prisoners slept in warm beds, bellies full, bodies healing. Sergeant Chen, observing from the doorway, later wrote in her report, "The psychological transformation of these women is complete. They have confronted the gap between propaganda and reality has won. This bodes well for Japan's post-war rehabilitation. Long-term impact." November 1946. Fumiko Tanaka stood on the deck of the LST Catoctin as it approached Yokohama Harbor. Repatriation had taken 14 months to arrange, delayed by logistics and the sheer scale of returning millions of Japanese personnel to their homeland. She had gained 9 kilograms during her captivity, her health restored to pre-war levels. Japan lay in ruins. From the ship, she could see Yokohama's devastated waterfront, burned buildings, empty lots, skeletal remains of the city she'd left in 1943. The contrast was brutal. She had been fed, clothed, and cared for while her countrymen starved. The guilt was crushing. Her family had survived, though barely. Her mother had lost teeth from malnutrition. Her younger sister had been evacuated to the countryside and worked in rice fields. Her father had died in March 1945 when American bombers hit the munitions factory. They wept when she returned. For grief, for relief, for the incomprehensibility of survival. "You look healthy," her mother said, voice brittle with something between accusation and gratitude. "The Americans fed you well." Yes, Fumiko answered simply. There was no adequate explanation for what she had experienced. July 1983. Fumiko Tanaka, now Fumiko Yoshida after her 1949 marriage, sat for an interview with researchers documenting POW experiences. At 61, she ran a small nursing school in Osaka, training a new generation of medical professionals in a Japan transformed beyond recognition. "The treatment we received as prisoners directly influenced my career," she told the interviewer. "I saw what medical care could be when resources were available, when human dignity was prioritized." After returning home, I resolved to bring that standard to Japan. She described the cognitive dissonance of her captivity, the systematic dismantling of propaganda beliefs through daily encounters with a reality that contradicted everything she'd been taught. The researchers asked if she felt bitterness about the deception. "Bitterness requires energy I no longer possess," Fumiko replied. "Instead, I feel responsibility to remember accurately, to teach honestly, to ensure the next generation understands that propaganda and truth are not synonyms." Studies conducted in the 1970s found that Japanese POWs held by Western allies during WW2 had significantly lower rates of post-war psychological trauma compared to those held by Soviet forces, where treatment had been harsh and survival rates poor. Historians attributed this to the Geneva Convention-compliant conditions in American camps. Many former prisoners, like Fumiko, became advocates for democracy and international cooperation during Japan's post-war reconstruction. March 1995. Fumiko attended a reunion in California where former Japanese POWs and their American guards gathered to mark the war's 50th anniversary. Sergeant Dorothy Chen, now 82 and retired from a career in State Department translation services, embraced Fumiko at the hotel entrance. "Do you remember the conversation we had?" Fumiko asked. "After Akiko approached that guard." Chen nodded. "You asked me why he refused. You said you couldn't understand." I understand now, Fumiko said quietly. He refused because he saw a person, not an object, because rules mattered more than opportunity, because your country had decided that even enemies deserve dignity. She paused. That choice, to treat prisoners as human, accomplished what no bomb could. It changed minds. It changed mine. The reunion brought together 60 former prisoners and 23 American veterans who had served as guards or administrators. They shared meals, photographs, memories. Some former prisoners had immigrated to America and raised families there. Others, like Fumiko, had returned to Japan but maintained lifelong gratitude for treatment that had defied propaganda predictions. During the closing ceremony, Colonel Takeshi Nakamura, now 91 and confined to a wheelchair, addressed the gathering. We were taught that America was weak, corrupt, deserving of contempt. Instead, we found abundance used for mercy, strength tempered by rules, and victory that did not require vengeance. This lesson shaped everything that followed. Historical assessment. The experience of Japanese POWs in Allied camps during WW2 represents a significant case study in the power of ethical treatment to transform attitudes. Historical records confirm that Japanese prisoners received Geneva Convention-compliant care, despite Japan's refusal to reciprocate for Allied prisoners in Japanese custody. Camp conditions included adequate food, approximately 2,800–3,000 calories daily, medical care, recreation facilities, and protection from abuse. These standards contrasted sharply with conditions in Japanese run camps, where Allied POWs received minimal rations, inadequate shelter, and systematic brutality. Approximately 35,000–50,000 Japanese personnel became POWs before Japan's August 1945 surrender. Post-war studies found that many prisoners provided valuable intelligence to Allied forces, often because they felt their humane treatment created a debt of gratitude. This intelligence contribution accelerated Allied strategic planning and potentially shortened the war. The long-term impact extended beyond the war. Many former Japanese POWs became advocates for democracy, international cooperation, and reconciliation during Japan's post-war occupation and reconstruction. Their first-hand experience with American values, contrasted against propaganda claims, created a generation of witnesses who could testify to the gap between militarist ideology and observed reality. Symbolic closure. Fumiko Yoshida passed away in 2008 at age 86. Her nursing school had graduated over 3,000 students. Her children and grandchildren lived in a prosperous, democratic Japan that bore little resemblance to the militarist empire of her youth. Among her possessions, her family found a small wooden box containing artifacts from Camp McCoy, a bar of lavender soap, never used, a photograph of the women's barracks, a copy of Life magazine from September 1945, and a handwritten note in fading ink. The note read, "The blanket was clean, the bread was soft. The Americans did not take what propaganda promised they would. In that gap between expectation and reality, my understanding of the world broke apart and rebuilt itself. Truth is more powerful than lies, but only if someone survives to testify to it. I survived. This is my testimony." The items were donated to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, where they remain on display, small objects carrying enormous weight, evidence that kindness can be a weapon more powerful than any bomb, and that the choice to see enemies as human beings might accomplish what violence never could.